Emmerdale that hasn't aired on ITV1 yet, but can be viewed on ITVX. April Windsor, Amelia Flanagan, made another major confession to boyfriend Dylan Penders, Fred Kettle, in today's episode of Emmerdale. She just didn't expect him to do the same thing after. Dylan is currently recovering in the village after being hit by a car that was being driven by Ray Walters, Joe Absalom. Prior to this, Dylan was trying to persuade Ray to go to the police about Celia Daniels, Jay Griffiths. Ray convinced Dylan that they would go and report the woman, but Ray drove his car towards the teen at the last moment in an attempt to silence him. While Dylan was in his coma in hospital, April's family tried to come up with a plan that would see them freed from Celia's clutches. They tried, but Marlon Dingle, Mark Charnock, and Rona Goskirk, Zoe Henry, couldn't come up with an answer to save themselves and their children. However, a few days ago, April discovered some important information that would mean her family could live a normal life again. But it meant she had to make a huge sacrifice. Ray and Celia are packing up their things on the farm with the intention of moving their operation to Wrexham, and have told April that she's going with them. The duo are continuing to use Callum's apparent murder against April, so the youngster feels like she doesn't have any choice but to follow their orders. In today's installment, April alluded to Dylan that it wouldn't be long until their nightmare would be over. Puzzled, Dylan pushed April for answers, and she eventually confirmed that she'd be leaving Emmerdale to go with Celia and Ray. To April, it seemed as though this was the only way to prevent her loved ones from living in fear. Dylan had been in hospital for what felt like a lifetime. A car, a deliberate shove, a coma. The village had circled him in anxious quiet. While Dylan slept, April's family had tried desperately to devise a way to free themselves from Celia's grip. Marlon and Rona had paced and argued and stared at maps, but their plans were maps without the secret roads you needed. April had kept jaw clenched, palms raw from worrying, until one night she had crept away from the farmhouse and found the small paper evidence that could dismantle the whole house of lies. It was a single trembling truth. Celia and Ray were not simply dangerous, they were organized, and their plans extended beyond the village to a new base in Wrexham. They were packing. They had told April she would be going with them. The bargain was brutal and precise. Stay, and they would make threats as long as the sun shone. Go, and they would claim their power by taking her away, where no one could see. To April, with the weight of her family's safety pressing on her, the choice had seemed smaller than it should have. She told Dylan she was going because it meant keeping others safe. She told him with the kind of quiet acceptance that made her voice small and brittle. Dylan woke up angry, which was easier to wear than his other feelings. He could see what April could not yet let herself see. During the slack days after he left the hospital, he had learned things in jagged fits. In conversations with nurses, in overheard phone calls, in the press of a new memory that shadowed the old one. He remembered Bear because he had found him on the farm weeks before, a tall creature with tired eyes who didn't know how to belong outside the fields. Dylan remembered attempts to free him, small kindnesses that had failed because Bear thought he was meant to be there. Now, sitting on a chair beside April's hospital bed, Dylan told her plainly, Celia used people. Bear was being treated like property. When a person sees another as property, it takes a village's courage to remember that the other person is not a thing. That thought lodged in April like a seed. It grew roots into worry, into fury, into the dangerous thing that felt like clarity. If they get him to Wrexham, April whispered, the hospital lights painting her face a tired animal gray, we won't find him again. Dylan rubbed the float of his thumb over the back of her hand. Then we don't let them take him. We don't let them take you. We make them look the other way long enough to get Bear out. We get you out. Marlon and Rona signed their consent to plan. Marlon's hand shook when he drew up logistics. Rona's mouth hardened into that steel-trimmed expression that could mean only one thing. She would not be outmaneuvered. The Dingles and the Penders had neighbors who had once owed favors, and farmers who kept quiet for reasons that were honorable and inconvenient in equal measure. It was not a grand army they could summon. It was a handful of people who could be brave in the exact right minute. The plan was as simple as it was dangerous. They would exploit the one thing Ray and Celia believed they controlled, their narrative of fear and presence. When Celia and Ray packed the van, sure they were moving to Wrexham, the villagers would stage a commotion on the opposite side of the farm. A scare made of smoke, a feigned animal emergency, anything to draw eyes and leave the back sheds with fewer watchers. While attention diverted, Dylan, April, and two others, a nervous but steady-eyed local named Sam, and Jess, who had once worked at the market and could move unseen, would slip into the bowels of the farm and find Bear. The aim was to get him to the village, to an address where he could be kept safe for the night until legal help could be called. It was a plan stitched together with prayer and thin rope. April kept thinking of Bear's face. The way he had cradled a stray chicken once with the gentleness of someone who remembered tenderness. She kept remembering how he flinched if you spoke too loudly, as if the world itself might raise a hand. She could not, would not, leave him to be hauled away again. The night they chose was a black one. Rain pelted the road like impatient fingers, and the kind of wind that made old timber protest creaked at the edges of the village. Ray and Celia moved with jittery efficiency. They were professional in their cruelty. They checked the locks, they counted the crates, and they smoked cigarettes like soldiers on watch. Celia's smile was the brittle kind that could be heard before it was seen. A diversion would need to be convincing. Marlon and Rona arranged for a fire in the hedgerow, a controlled scare that would be the village's responsibility. They could rely on the local volunteer brigade to treat the alarm seriously. Ray and Celia would have to go see. Meanwhile, the farm's perimeter camera had a blind spot beneath a row of sycamores. A blind spot that Sam had memorized months ago while delivering feed. "There are no guarantees," Jess said when they huddled in Dylan's battered pickup, the engine off, phones dim. "Just the sort of hope you get when you can't stand being quiet any longer." Dylan's jaw worked. Sometimes hope is enough for one good minute. April swallowed. She had rehearsed what she would say to Bear if they found him. She would tell him they were there, that it wasn't his fault, that no one would take him again. Those were the words she needed to say as much as he needed to hear them. They slipped from shadow to shadow, as a band of ghosts. The farm breathed in the smell of horses and stale smoke, and a human business that had tasted like money and violence for too long. A dog barked somewhere, cropped by distance. They found the back shed where Bear and the other coerced workers slept, a rough barn, lined with pallets and the ghosts of sleeping men. Bear was there, curled in on himself like a coat left too long at the back of a closet. He did not stir when April's voice broke the hush. He did not trust voices anymore. "Bear," April said softly. Her voice was the same voice she had used when she whispered secrets to her grandmother. It was a voice meant to fold people into the light. "It's April. Listen to me, please. It's me." For a moment, nothing happened, and the world thinned to the point of fearing failure. Then slowly, Bear's eyes opened, pale, lumbering, as if the light had been turned on in an empty room. He peered at April the way someone checks a stranger for a face they used to know. April crouched, the rain a sheet against her hair. "Do you remember me? From the market? From the school fete?" Bear's blink was a small, bewildered thing. He looked not as a man made for fighting, but as someone surprised by the idea of being noticed. You look like April," he said. His voice came out like it's been used rarely, a tool cobwebbed with disuse. "You shouldn't be here." They said. "They lie," Dylan said, stepping forward, his shoulder brushing April's. "They're leaving tonight. They're trying to take you to Wrexham, Bear. We won't let them." Bear's shoulders tightened. "They say it's safer. They say I would be lost if I left." "You'd be lost if you stayed," April said. "Come with us. Please. We can get you somewhere safe." In the thin, electric hush of that barn, Bear looked at Dylan, at April, and then, finally, at himself. It was like watching the closing of a centuries-old shell. Recognition is a small, stubborn flame. When it takes, it can be fierce. "How do I know?" he asked. "How do I know you'll stay? They've shown me how people leave." "You don't have to know everything," Jess said, voice barely more than a thread. "You just have to trust us for 1 minute." The minute stretched. The farmhouse brigade outside began their performance. Marlon kept his voice steady across the line. Firefighters feigning confusion, villagers calling for help. In the barn, footsteps creaked from the upper loft where the farmhands sometimes slept. Ray's laugh drifted down like a thread on the wind. "We need to move," Sam whispered. They wrapped Bear in a borrowed coat and gave him a hat to hide his face. His limbs were stiff with disuse, his hands, which had once been gentle with animals, trembled. They led him to the shadow that was the sycamore blind spot, Dickensian and small against the great wet sky. For a heartbeat, the world felt like it would fail them. A car door slammed too close. The sound flapped like a gull. Then, as if the village had pulled its collective breath and held it, they slipped. They crossed under the sycamore and into the drizzle-swept road. The pickup idled like a patient beast, and Dylan guided Bear into the back, covering him with a tarpaulin and a fleece that smelled of Marlon's old coat. April climbed in beside him and touched his shoulder. Bear flinched, then pressed his head into April's palm and let out a sound that might have been a laugh, but was more a cracking noise of old things making room for new ones. They drove away like thieves and saints, the farmhouse shrinking in the wet rear view like a dog that had been called and abandoned. Behind them, Celia and Ray were getting out of their van, hair wild with worry. Someone on the farm had set the hedgerow alight as planned, and the volunteers' sirens flashed an artificial panic. Ray cursed, his face carved into panic as much as cruelty. Celia's smile had joined the firelight and looked small and defeated. Back in the village, safe for the moment, Bear sat with a blanket around his knees and stared at his hands. They were not hands that had been free for any set of days. They belonged to someone who had been taught to build and to beg forgiveness at the same time. Dylan brewed tea like a modern alchemist, passing the heavy mug to Bear with the kind of tenderness that made April think he would be a good father someday, even if he hadn't planned on that. "You did it," Bear said finally, voice hoarse and raw. "You did this for me." "No," April said. "We did it because we couldn't stand the thought of you being taken. Because someone told us about you. Because you matter." Bear's laugh this time was a small, rusty thing that had the sound of a door opening. "I didn't know people like that existed," he said. "People who'd risk themselves. People like us are in the village," Marlon said from the doorway. He looked tired and older, the night's exertions pressing lines of worry across his face, but his eyes gleamed. "We just needed a reason to do something that wasn't sensible." The police arrived later, called by Rona and a trembling but courageous solicitor who had agreed to put her life on hold for the night. Celia and Ray's operation unraveled faster than a cheap sweater in a washing machine. Evidence April had hidden away, photographs, receipts, the small folded paper that proved the extent of their plans, found its way into the hands of a calm detective with humane eyes. By dawn, the pair were being questioningly detained, their new Wrexham journey shelved by orange tape and legal paperwork. Bear, for the first time since he could remember, slept without waking to the sound of footsteps. He woke to a bowl of porridge and Dylan making a face, as he pretended it was burningly hot. He met people who did not ask him to earn their patience or prove his worthiness with sweat and obedience. He had the gentle stares of neighbors who knew how to wait without prying, and had the careful curiosity of children who loved without the agenda that adults often carried. Hope is a strange and tender contagion. It spread through the village like a sweet, improbable fermentation. People who had been complicit by silence found themselves called by conscience. A local care worker took Bear by the hand and began to inquire about his past properly, asking with a professional delicacy that didn't pry but allowed. Social services found a temporary but safe placement where Bear could begin to untangle himself from the expectations that had been knotted into him. April watched Bear find small, halting laughter. The way he laughed at an old joke Marlon told, the way he frowned at a book, the way he made friends with a nervous spaniel down by the river. She found that saving someone changes you. It sets a new compass in your chest. She and Dylan sat on the bench outside the vicarage one evening, arms brushing as the cold came in like a neat, clean thing. "He's going to be okay," Dylan said, staring at the river where a heron stalked its own patient life. "But he needs time. And so do you." April nodded. Her life had been reshaped by the hard edges of events. She had been forced, by danger, into becoming someone who could plan rescues. But she also knew that in the aftermath she had room to be someone small and ordinary too. A girl who would bake bread with her mother, who would argue with Marlon over the best way to mend a fence, who would learn to sleep without the iron weight on her chest. In the weeks that followed, the village watched as Bear learned the language of no and yes again. He learned that home could be a place you did not have to pay for with submission. He stood in a small, sunlit room with a support worker and cried for perhaps the first time properly. Not tears of panic, but of release. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Emmerdale Echoes.